The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Q. Can one blind person lead another? Won't they both fall into the ditch? The student is not superior to the teacher, but if the students are well taught, they will become like the teacher. Why do you notice a speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and not the wooden plank in your own? How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the sawdust out of your eye," when you cannot see the plank in your own? Remove the plank first from your own eye, then you will see clearly enough to remove the sawdust from your brother's eye. No good tree produces rotten fruit, and no bad tree produces good fruit. Each tree is known by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from bushes, nor gather grapes from blackberry brambles. Good people draw what is good from the measure of their own hearts. Bad people produce what is bad from the evil within them. A person's words flow from what is treasured in the heart. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and then do not do what I say? I will show you what the person who comes to me, hears what I have to say, and acts accordingly is really like. That person is like somebody building a house who digs deeply and lays the foundation on bedrock. The rain pours down, the floods rise in a torrent, and the winds blow and beat upon that house, but it does not fall. It's built on rock. But the one who listens and does nothing is like the person who builds a house on sand with no foundations. When the river bursts against it, it collapses immediately and is destroyed. The gospel inspired by God. Were any of you guys involved in the Catholic charismatic movement in the 60s and 70s? Yeah, merge, yeah, okay, bunch of people. So it was an extraordinary phenomenon. It's hard to know what actually precipitated it. I mean, it may have been some kind of an indirect result of Vatican II between 58 and 62, that there was some real change happening in the Catholic Church, and John the 23rd wanted to throw open the windows and let the fresh air into the church and into the Vatican again. So it may have been part of that. But it was hugely influenced by Pentecostalism, and it was an extraordinary movement. I got involved in it when I went to Kenya in the 70s, and was involved in it for my 15 or 16 years. And certainly I know that it had a significant effect on my own thinking, my own spirituality. It was a whole new branch. But when I look at it sociologically, what amazed me was that people who were involved in the Catholic charismatic renewal, they didn't stop being Catholics. In fact, they tended to be very, very devout Catholics, who went to Mass even daily, and kept all the rules of the church and didn't eat sausages on Friday. So it's not like they were separating out from the church. They were very, very devout Catholics. But then they would have meetings apart from the church. They'd meet several times a week, and they'd pray together, and they were praying in tongues, and they had healing ministries, and they were into prophecy. So it was an extraordinary movement that moved through the church. But they didn't leave the church in order to be, to get involved in this movement. And that's basically what happened to the young Christian movement shortly after the death of Jesus Christ. We look back now at 2,000 years, and we think, that, they were totally against Judaism at the time and they abandoned Judaism. That's absolutely not the case. These young Christians, they were all Jewish to begin with, and they were all deeply devout Jews. And so they went to the temple on a regular basis, and they kept kosher, and they kept Sabbath, and they kept all 613 precepts of the Torah. And then they met on their own on Sundays and held their Eucharistic encounters and had their prayer meetings and were into healings and prophecy and tongues, just like the Pentecostal movement. Until about the mid-40s. And in the 40s, 50s, 60s, up to the year 70 AD, things began to change really, really dramatically. Because in the 40s, the movement began to spread out into the Gentile world, courtesy mainly of Paul's preaching. So a whole bunch of Gentiles began to join this movement. And at the very same time, and we don't realize this, but when you look at the Acts of the Apostles, there's a lot of evidence there that a lot of priests, Jewish priests and Pharisees also joined the young movement, the young Christian movement. Now, you think this would be really good news. The priests and the theologians and their Johnny the Jude movement, wow, this is great. It's getting legitimized. But what was happening was they were tending to hold it back totally down to its Jewish roots, and not letting it move. And so the first council of the church was called in the year 49 AD, if you could call it a council. It was probably maybe 40 or 50 guys meeting in a room. But, we call it the first council of the church. And it's called the Council of Jerusalem. It was held in 49 AD, and there was basically just one item of agenda. Paul was complaining that when he was preaching to the Gentiles, that people from Jerusalem, and he called them the Judaizers, were following him around from village to village. And whenever he preached about Jesus Christ, they would insist to the population, but if you want to be followers of Jesus, you have to convert to Judaism. And if you're men, you have to get circumcised. And you got to keep kosher and the Sabbath and all 613 precepts. And then you could be a follower of Jesus as well. And Paul was really upset about this. So the first council was called to address this issue. And the decision at the young church was, no, Gentiles, in order to become Christians, do not have to become Jews first. So the Jews will stay Jewish and they'll keep kosher and all these laws, but we don't expect this from the Gentiles who want to be followers of Jesus. So there's this big, sea change is beginning to happen at this stage. And that's basically what I'm going to talk about this morning. And I'm going to make 4 main points. So the first one I call models of holiness. And the second one I will talk about John's secret, the gospel that Ron read for us this morning, John's secret. Then thirdly, I'm going to talk about altered states of consciousness. And then fourthly, I'm going to call it modernizing the metaphors. So they're the 4 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, models of holiness. Jesus said very, very famously at one stage, he said, you can't put new wine into old wineskins because the new wine is so corrosive, it'll burst the skins. You're going to lose the wine and you're going to lose the wineskin. You got new wine, you got to put it in new wineskins. So what's this about? It's about radical transformation of the models of our spirituality. You can't stuff new ideas into old cosmologies. It doesn't work. And we know this from the scientific model as well. Basically, the scientific system it looks like the following. A scientist in any discipline, whether it's a geologist or whether it's a physicist or a mathematician or sociologist, whatever it is, the scientist is somebody who looks at a massive data and is trying to recognize are there any patterns emerging from the data. And then at some stage she thinks she's identified a pattern and she creates a hypothesis to explain the putative pattern. But then she has to test it in the laboratory. So she's going to set up some kind of an experimental protocol to figure out whether this pattern in fact is real or just imaginary or just a statistical fluke. And if it proves to be real, then it has to be replicated in a few other laboratories just to make sure that it's not just a statistical aberration. And then if it's established as a truth, it becomes a principle in the scientific discipline. And you put a whole bunch of scientific principles together and you get a scientific model. And that allows us to orient ourselves in the natural world. But at some stage, new anomalous data begin to come in. And now we have to somehow tweak the model to accommodate the new data. But at some stage, so much new anomalous data come in that no matter how much tweaking we do to the old models, they can't contain or explain the new data. And then we have to dismantle the old models and create brand new models that can explain all the old data and the new stuff as well. And it happened twice in the 20th century with relativity theory and with quantum mechanics, that the old Newtonian model was totally inadequate to understanding the microcosmic world. And so you had to build a new model that could explain everything that Newton could explain, but could explain also what was happening at the quantum mechanical level. And so if that's true in science, it is equally true in our spirituality. Our spirituality is the same thing. We observe in our spiritual practice on a day-to-day basis what appears to be reality. And then we infer some kinds of patterns and principles from that, and we create our cosmologies or our theologies. But inevitably, as we live life and as we move from era to era, new anomalous experiences begin to address us. And no matter how much we tweak the old cosmologies, it can't accommodate the new data. And then we have got to, as Jesus says, make brand new wineskins to put this new wine in. Now the good news is you can put old wine in new wineskins as well as new wine. But you can't put new wine in old wineskins because the wine is lost and the skins are broken. But you can put old wine into new skins. And you can put new wine into new skins. So the new model can accommodate the good, of the old and the good of the new. So this becomes really, really important then. These models of spirituality. Now that's the background to it. Now to situate it kind of in a particular context then, around the year 721 BC, that specific date actually, 10 of the tribes of Israel were taken into exile by the great Assyrian Empire of the time. And they're devastated, they're demolished, they're never heard of again. Either they got assimilated or they got wiped out through ethnocide, but they never appear again. So 10 of the 12 tribes are gone shortly after the year 721 BC, courtesy of the Assyrian Empire. There's 2 tribes left, hanging on for dear life. In the year 587 BC, the new empire, which is the Babylonian Empire, comes in and it deports the last 2 tribes. And now they're beginning to think, oh my God, we're going to go the way of our brothers. We're going to be annihilated, and that will be the end of us. So they were trying to figure out, is there some way we can maintain our individuality as a nation? Is there some way we can kind of hold on? And it's at this stage then that they begin to develop a totally different kind of spirituality. The old spirituality was inadequate. They got demolished. Is there some way they can retain their sense of community identity? And it's at this stage in Judaism that they start inventing the notion of salvation through separation. And it goes back to a text from the prophet Isaiah, who had a vision in the year 742 BC, where he enters the temple, and he has a vision of God, and God's train fills the temple, and he's surrounded by cherubim and seraphim who are singing, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy is the Lord God of hosts. So they go back to that statement, and they begin to think, what makes God holy is that God is totally other and totally separated from. And therefore, if we are to survive, we need a spirituality based on separation. So it's at this stage, and not before, that they invent the notion of table fellowship. You can't eat with non-Jews. They refuse intermarriage with the neighboring tribes. They're not going to dilute, their own kind of DNA. They invent the Sabbath, which separates the clean day or the holy day of the week from the working day of the week. They separate kosher from treif, clean foods from the unclean food. And so they're at this stage now, they're very, very definitely trying to hold themselves together as a unit. And it's succeeded. And they survived the exile, and when the Persian Empire overthrew the Babylonians in 529 BC, they're allowed back into the land of Israel. Now, in fact, only 24,000 of them choose to go back. The rest of them choose to live on, to stay on in Babylon. But those who come back, they rebuild the temple, and they start, a new phase of Judaism. So this was the Judaism that Jesus would have inherited. But the problem was, under Roman occupation, the Romans came in about 70 BC and dominated and were there at the time of Jesus. And under the Roman occupation, Judaism was fragmenting again. And this old model was no longer working for them. In fact, there are 3 new approaches happening at the time of Jesus. There's the Pharisaic response to this, which is legalism, taken to the nth degree, that you must fastidiously keep all 613 precepts of the Torah, and then and only then will God kick the Romans out for us. The Essenes had a totally different response to it. Their response was, it is through asceticism. We have to go off into the desert and purify ourselves because even ritual Judaism has gotten corrupted. The temple is corrupted. We're going to withdraw completely to the desert and sanctify ourselves. And the Zealot party had a different answer. They felt that it was physical violence, guerrilla warfare was going to get rid of the Romans. Now this is the maelstrom in which Jesus finds himself. And he has a totally different response to it. It is not going to be holiness through separation. It's not going to be through violence. It's not going to be through asceticism. It's not going to be through legalism. It's going to be salvation through association. A total novel concept. He's going to be hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners. He's going to be eating and drinking with everybody. And they will call him a drunkard and a glutton. Look at John the Baptist. John was living on just locusts and wild honey. And here you are, a drunkard and a glutton, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But Jesus had discovered what the Buddha had discovered 500 years before him. That there are different kinds of spiritualities. There are basically what have been called the descending spiritualities and the ascending spiritualities. So maybe the first spirituality on the planet was a kind of a descending model of spirituality, where it was a kind of a pantheistic notion that God was the totality of nature, and that God was to be found in nature. And therefore, loving nature, cultivating nature, being aware of our own sensuality and indulging our sensuality, that this was the way to honor the divine. So it's a very feminine kind of way, it's a very nurturing kind of way, and that was the original maybe spirituality. There was a sea change came at some stage where you have an ascending spirituality which is going to be predicated on asceticism and legalism. And this will be a very masculine form of spirituality. That the way you get to be holy is by realizing somehow that the soul is trapped inside the body. The body is evil, and nature is evil, and women are seductresses. And so anything that has to do with sensuality, or nature, or femininity, or nurtureness, or being nice to yourself is wrong. It's an entrapment, and you get to heaven by all kinds of ascetical practices. And so these are the waters in which, the roiling waters in which Jesus is trying to attempt a sea change. So that brings me to my second point then. This then, for me, is the whole purpose of the secret book of John. The secret book of John is a Gnostic scripture, 3 copies of which were found in Nag Hammadi in 1945. But in actual fact, 50 years earlier, another copy of the same document had been found. And all 4 copies, the physical papyri, go back to about the 4th century. But obviously, the teaching themselves go much further back than that. And as you heard, as Ron read this morning, the story behind it is the following. As I said, the early Christian church is completely Jewish, and they're totally devout Jews. And so we learned that John has gone up to the temple. This would have been a weekly event for him, or maybe even a daily event. He continues to attempt to attend the temple. And he's in the temple, and a Pharisee, confronts him. And as you had Ron read so beautifully for us, he's making a mockery of John. So he says, "Where's your master now?" And John says, "He's gone back to where he came from." Right, likely story. And then he says, "He seduced you guys. He was a traitor to the cause. He has destroyed the tradition of our people that has held us together for hundreds of years, and he trampled all over it. And that's the guy you're following?" And John has a crisis of faith. John is really, really upset, really disturbed. My God, what if it's true? What if I'm dedicating my life to somebody who was a charlatan? What if Jesus was the Antichrist? I'm spending my entire life preaching something. Maybe it's true. Maybe he just trampled all over the traditions of our forefathers and destroyed Judaism. And here am I, aiding and abetting this process. So he's having a crisis of faith. So he leaves and he goes off into the desert to try to sort stuff out for himself. And in the desert, he has a vision. And what he gets is that you can't solve these problems from the same mindset that created it. A rational dialogue with somebody who's operating just from a laptop between your ears will not solve a problem which is a mystical problem. You have to transcend, you have to go trans-rational, which is not the abandonment of reason, it is the transcending of reason. In the very same way that a tree, as it sends its branches into the sky, is not abandoning its roots in the process. But it's not just a root system, it's got a trunk and it's got branches and it's got leaves. It has to keep evolving and growing. And John has this powerful experience this morning, in which he sees this light approach him. And the light shifts, it's a shape-shifting light. Initially, it appears to be a youth. And then it appears to be an old man, and finally it appears to be a servant. Now, as I was meditating on this morning, the image that came to me was, this is very, very, very like the Hindu model of the 4 stages of life, except John has telescoped 2 into the first one. In traditional Hinduism, a person went through 4 very distinct phases. This is what we expected. The first 20 years, you were a student, and you apprenticed yourself to some kind of a guru or a teacher, and you cared for him, make sure he had food to eat, and did his laundry for him, and in return he taught you spirituality. That was the first 20 years. Next 20 years, from 20 to 40, you were a householder. You got married, you started a family of your own, you had kids of your own, and when the first grandchild was born, so you're around 40 at this stage, then you become a forest dweller. Your work is done, you've raised your kids, you go off into the forest now on a spiritual quest, and you spend 20 years there. And then you come back into society for the last 20 years, which is called the sannyasin. You become a beggar, and you literally go around with a bowl looking for food from people who were formerly your servants. So there were the 4 phases in Hinduism. So John is intimating, he collapsed him into 3. So the first stage is the youth, the one who is searching and seeking. And then the next one is the elder, this person who's filled with wisdom. And then the third stage that John sees is the servant, the person who comes back into the world now, like the Buddhist notion, before enlightenment, you split wood and draw water. After enlightenment, you split wood and you draw water. And so you come back and you're a servant of the community. And so here's what John is saying. And the light speaks to him and says, I am the Father, and I am the Mother, and I am the Son. So it's very interesting. The image that comes to me is this, that it's like this light is telling him, I am the descending religion, I am the ascending religion, and I am the cross-fertilization of the two. The descending religion will be the feminine face of God, the ascending religion will be the masculine face of God, and the Son is the cross-fertilization of these two. What does that look like? Jesus calls it the truly human being. The truly human being is the cross-fertilization of the spiritualities that have gone before, but taking it to a stage which has gone beyond that. And this is what John sees. But the extraordinary thing is, John did not think himself into this position. He could not think himself. He could not solve the problem the Pharisee had set for him. He could not deal with his doubt by using his intellect. He had to transcend intellect. It had to be some kind of a trans-rational experience. He had to alter his state of consciousness in order to solve the problem created by his intellect. Just exactly as Einstein said famously one time, you can't solve any problem from the same mindset that created it. You have to transcend the data and go to a higher level, and then the connections between the data become much more obvious. So that was John's secret, was that he transcended mere intellect. He carried it with him, he didn't abandon it, but he transcended it, which then brings me to my third point. So what's the deal with altered states of consciousness, and how does it affect us? And in order to get into this topic, I want to just redefine three terms that I've done this a few times for you. And the first one is based on the realization that there's a philosophical fallacy which in the literature is called the myth of the given. And the myth of the given is the fallacy that would have us believe that what our senses deliver to us is an accurate one-to-one mapping of what's out there. So we act, particularly in the scientific community, that as if the data given to us by our sensorium, or by extension through our instrumentation, is an accurate representation of what's actually out there. Now, we actually managed to dispel this with quantum theory, which tells us that in the absence of an observing consciousness, nature is not free to reveal itself. The observing consciousness determines how the wave of all possibilities is collapsed down to the actual outcome. So in the absence of an observing consciousness, our mindset, our cosmology, the wave does not collapse. And so we have to realize that the models of reality we've constructed were based on a tiny slice of the pie. It's almost as if you were to bring somebody into this room, a person who only had one sense. Let's say they were blind and deaf, and they had no sense of taste, or smell. They only had tactile ability. That's the only ability they had. And you let them loose in this room for an hour, and then you somehow interrogate them and ask them to tell us what this room is like. And on the basis of just tactile impressions, they're going to have to describe what this room is. And of course, they're going to miss most of the data. They're going to miss all the colors. They're going to miss the contours. They're going to miss the smells of the wood and the ceiling and the people inside it. They're going to miss everything except what their fingertips can represent it to us. And we're in the same thing. We operate, even with the electromagnetic spectrum. If you were to represent the electromagnetic spectrum as a 3,000-mile line joining LA to New York, the visible portion of that spectrum is the diameter of a dime. For the rest of it, our sensorium cannot deliver it to us. And we're creating our models of reality on that tiny little spectrum. And then we wonder, why our maps of reality, our cartography is so much off. So altering our states of consciousness is so very, very important. And so reality is much, much more extensive than that which our sensorium can deliver to us, or even our scientific instrumentation can deliver to us. It's much greater than that. And the secret to it is to alter our states of consciousness, is to bring other senses to bear on the experience of reality. And so we have to let go of the myth of the given. What we register through our sensorium and our cognitive processes is not a one-to-one mapping of what's out there. All we can say is that given particular kinds of equipment, particular senses with particular ranges, and a particular model of a laptop between the ears, here's what we can deduce from it. But we have no idea whether that corresponds at all to what's out there. So that's the first piece. So reality then for me is not just that which can be, delivered by the sensorium and understood by cognition. Reality is any experience that humans have, and a lot more than that. So what you dream is real. What you see in your visions is real. What you imagine is real. What you feel is real. They're all levels of reality. None is, less real than the other. And if you want to make your maps of ultimate reality, you've got to factor these in. And the best we can say is that we can attempt, by altering our states of consciousness, to make slightly less inaccurate maps of reality. Because we're never going to get the total picture until we're back at source. Because our sensorium and even the other faculties are incapable of delivering all the data that allow us to create complete models. All we can hope for is that our models become slightly less, inadequate as we branch out and experiment with different states of consciousness. And so we have to learn how to do that. And so, how do we do that? Jesus shows us many, many, many times. John showed us this morning. Jesus goes on to Mount, Tabor, and he's in an experience where he's having an encounter with Moses and Elijah. Moses was dead 1,250 years. Elijah was dead 800 years. And here is Jesus having a conversation. So there are dimensions of reality, or there are states of consciousness in which time, means nothing. You can move backwards and forwards in time. And in fact, every single one of us experiences this when you dream at night. Very, very often, I'll have dreams in which, I'm bringing my grandfather to meet my grandnephew. They were born, the grandnephew was born 60 years after my grandfather died. But in dreams, they're meeting each other. And so we experience it, that we can transcend chronology and time. And the laws of causation and physics, they don't apply in different dimensions. They apply, the laws of the physical dimension are not the laws that govern the dimension that constitute our dreams, or our lucid dreams, or our visionary experiences, our intuition. And so there are exercises we can engage in to try to prompt, movement into other states of consciousness, like a meditation practice, or like spending time in nature, or like spending time with little children. Because truth, as I've defined it many times, truth is something is only true. Truth is not the same as fact. Something can be factual but not true, and something can be true but not factual. So something is true if it transforms me and aligns me with God. And something is ultimate truth if it transforms me radically and aligns me permanently with God. So truth is not about factoids. Factoids are just, the data points from our physical universe. And they're important because we live in a physical universe some of the time. It's important to know what they are, but they're not the ultimate truth. Something is real true if it transforms me at core and aligns me permanently with God. And imagination then for me is this. Imagination is not a faculty which allows me to make up stuff which is not real. That is not imagination. That's fantasy. That's very different. Imagination is the faculty that allows one to move into altered states of consciousness by shifting your frequency. And when you shift your frequency, you perceive energies and entities which are not of the physical domain. And you learn how to interact with them. And you take back their wisdom, or their cosmologies, or their insights, or their models of reality, and you bring it back into this reality, and you cross-fertilize it with this, and you expand your models. And that's primarily the function of imagination. And it's in my opinion, it's the greatest scientific tool of all. The great scientists, are people who got great imaginations. I'm always fascinated by the story of when the president of Princeton was trying to persuade Einstein, to come and work with him, in the 1930s, and he was offering him all kinds of things, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment, whatever you need. So he interviews Einstein, and he says to Einstein, what kind of a laboratory do you need? What do you need me to set up for you? And Einstein says, well, I'm definitely going to need a table and a chair. I need a chair, and these big legal yellow pads, I need a lot of those, and a whole bunch of pencils. Okay, look at me, said, and the equipment? No, just that. Because that was his laboratory. His laboratory was his imagination. He would sit on a photon of light and travel off into space, and then imagine what it would be like. What would happen to mass and time and length when that happened. So his laboratory was imagination, because imagination is the ability that allows us to go into other dimensions, interact with energies and entities, cross-fertilize our thinking, and bring it back here. And so altering our state of consciousness is a sine qua non without which we can't, really become deeply spiritual people, because we're going to become like the Pharisee in the temple telling John that Jesus, was a tradition buster, rather than saying what Jesus really was, that he was, taking it to the next level. This brings me to my fourth point. So I'm going to call it modernizing the metaphors. I had this weird notion this morning as I was meditating of Jesus on Palm Sunday. So you know the story. On Palm Sunday, it was a tradition. It was the Passover festival for Judaism. The population of Jerusalem would go from 40,000 people to 1.25 million people at Passover. Jews from all over the world would congregate. So the population just mushroomed. And the Romans, of course, were really, really on edge when this happened. And so there would be a demonstration of power whereby, in this instance, Pontius Pilate, or the governor of Judea, would march in from Caesarea Philippi, which was a town on the coast, and he'd march in on this huge, pompous war horse, bedecked with all kinds of plumes, with his garrisons of disciplined legionaries walking beside him. And Jesus did a symbolic gesture where he used a hijacked donkey and a bunch of rabble-rousers to walk behind him, and he came in through the western gate as Pilate is coming in through the eastern gate. Now, I had this weird vision this morning. What if Jesus were to come back now, and he landed in the middle of the current great empire? What would the imagery look like? And I had this vision of the president coming in a helicopter, from one side of Washington, D.C., and Jesus coming in on a hijacked, hang glider with a whole bunch of beach bums running along underneath him. And this would be the symbol, somehow, that the way forward was love. It wasn't power, it wasn't ICBMs, it wasn't drones, that wasn't the way forward. And as I was thinking about that, I started to read this, the Gospel of Q, and this image that Jesus had of the house, that the true human being is the person who seeks, who really listens, and then who acts upon what's being heard. So there has to be an active search going on. And there has to be true listening, not listening just with my intellect, but listening with my heart. And then there has to be action. And he uses the image of a house. He says, I'll tell you what that person is like. That person is like somebody, who wanted to build a house. And they dug down deeply until they found bedrock, and they built their foundation on bedrock. And then the rains came down, and the floods rose, and the winds buffeted it. It was solid as rock. And the person who either doesn't seek, or is not really listening, or doesn't act on what he's heard, it's like the person who just, as we say in Swahili, he just built it ovyo. He just, here's a nice plot, here's the house, no foundations whatsoever. The rain comes, the whole thing subsides, and he's washed out of it. So I was thinking, what image would Jesus use if he came back in 2013? And he wants to stick with the image of a house. So I had this image, and this is one I've mentioned once before, of not just a simple house, but a skyscraper. So I want you for a few minutes to imagine this skyscraper, the circular, cylindrical skyscraper, many, many floors high, and it's built in a circle. And there is a device in the center, an elevator shaft in the center, and you get onto the elevator shaft and it'll bring you up through the various floors. And when you stop off at any floor, there's a circular corridor surrounding the elevator shaft. And there are 8 rooms opening on each floor. And these represent for me states of consciousness. I'm just saying 8, there's a lot more than that. So for instance, there's waking consciousness, there's sleeping consciousness, there's dreaming consciousness, there's hypnopompic consciousness, there's hypnagogic consciousness, there's deity mystical consciousness, there's nature mystical consciousness, there's formless mystical consciousness, there's non-dual mystical consciousness. So we experience all these states of consciousness. But let's say it's just 8. So each floor has 8 rooms, and you can walk into the room. And as you walk into the room, obviously, you're walking into a pie-shaped room. So the door you walk into is curved, but it's a small curve, and the wall is much bigger. And you walk into the first room, and you see that there's a mural sketched on the wall. You say, wow, that's very, very interesting. I wonder what that's about. And you're trying to figure out, what's it saying. And then you come out, and you close the door, and you walk along the corridor, and you go into the next room. And there's a mural on the wall of the next room. You say, wow, interesting. Oh, I wonder if that's connected to the other mural. And you visit all 8 rooms on the floor. And then, bingo, you get it. It's a single mural, but there are 8 segments of the mural. And until you visit all of them, you couldn't see what the mural was. And that's a little bit like what, our cartographies are like. Until you visit many states of consciousness, you don't get what the mural is about. If you're just looking through a particular lens, you see a piece of it, and it doesn't particularly make sense until you begin to connect it up to all the other pieces on the ground. But it gets much more complex than that. Because they're just states of consciousness. They're also stages of consciousness. Anybody will have experiences of states. You don't have to be a guru or an avatar to experience different states of consciousness. We all experience them. Stages of consciousness are very different. That's how we grow in our realizations of what reality consists of. So now you go back in. Most people, they only go to the first floor. And most people, in fact, just go into one room. They're in one room on one floor and say, now I've understood what life is about. It's about getting, a bigger car. It's about, getting a better job or, marrying the ideal person or whatever it is. They don't leave the room, so they have no idea what the mural actually looks like. But even those who begin to experiment, very often they're stuck on one floor. Jesus is inviting us to have the courage to get back on the elevator and go up to the next floor, and the next floor, and the next floor. And what happens is, you begin to realize there are different versions of the mural. You go into the second floor and you visit all the rooms, all the states of consciousness, and you begin to see that whereas the mural on the first floor was just stick figure mural, the second floor is black and white realistic. You can really recognize people and faces because it's drawn much more realistically, but it's in black and white. If you get to this third floor, you realize the mural is realistic and it's in color, it's in vibrant color. So it's much more alive than it was on level 2 and certainly than level 1. You go up to the next level and you find out that you're encountering a 3-dimensional holographic mural. So it literally is, there's 3-dimensionality to it. That's a totally different experience from the stick figures on floor 1. You go up to the next floor and you realize not only is it holographic, it's interactive. You're actually in dialogue with and influencing how the mural is behaving. And there are many stages, obviously, beyond that. So this is what I think Jesus is talking about, that this secret book of John is talking about. It's the invitation and the realization that as long as we continue to map reality or to make be cartographers of reality based on just this little dime-sized piece of the electromagnetic spectrum, or even of just a single state of consciousness, we're going to be woefully inadequate. There is no way we can become enlightened beings, and there is no way we can usher peace and love into our societies or into our times. There have to be pioneers and avatars who have the courage to go up the elevator shaft, not knowing what's going to happen at the next floor, whether they're going to be annihilated, or ever come back. They have no idea whether they're going to come back or be annihilated. But as Paul keeps telling us, the quest for the kingdom costs not less than everything. And so we have to commit everything we have, which is it's not about giving away everything you own and going off into the desert. It's about having the ability to utilize all the resources that God has given you, including your imagination and your memory and your sense of what is real and your sensorium and this little laptop and your visionary experiences and nature and children and meditation and intuition, to use all of these things so that finally you have the courage to see what does floor 2 and 3 and 4 begin to look like.